What is up, everybody? We are back on Peep. This review does What If. Guys, we are episode 8 out of 9. Wow, what an interesting episode. Lot to say on this one. Might run a little bit longer than usual, but as always, guys, thank you so much for checking us out. We have just one more episode of this series coming out just next week. We may be on a little bit of a delay of recording that one, as I will be on vacation in the most magical place on Earth, which you should know to be Disney World, and you'd be correct. But with that said, guys, let's get into episode 8, which is aptly titled, What If Ultron Won? So let's back up a little bit and just go 1 week prior, guys, to episode 7, where we kind of had this really, up-tempo, upbeat episode with Thor, and there was a lot of comedy, there were some lighter moments, and at the very end of the episode, you see kind of the only thing that has happened really in the entire episode that odes to something like really grand in scale from a multiverse perspective, right? Which is the arrival of what looks like Ultron in the body of Vision, with just like a massive drone army behind him, right? So that was really the only thing that kind of felt like it had any real, repercussion or any real long-standing effect in that universe that we saw Thor and company in. But this episode almost makes you wonder whether you're kind of getting a little bit of cohesion across these episodes, and I'll explain what I mean. This episode sort of kicks us off into a multiverse in which Ultron has won, and what does that victory mean, right? Essentially, Ultron has kind of, inhabited Vision's body, assumedly the same Vision's body that would have been created by Tony Stark, which is touched on briefly during the episode. And by taking over his body, he's, of course, also taken over the Mind Stone, which is a pretty big deal. And in this process, he kind of starts a nuclear holocaust. No big deal, right? But in doing this, we now have seen essentially the end of what we know of our canon Avengers. And the only two that seem to be left out of this group are Clint and Natasha, which is kind of cool to see them two kind of go back into their rhythm of sort of, while we're not getting the voice of Black Widow, we are getting that traditional sort of, Clint Barton and Natasha Romanoff banter, which feels good and it plays well. So these two are kind of trying to go through the trenches and figure out what exactly they can do to stop this version of Ultron, who is seemingly leaps and bounds, maybe more powerful than the one we even got to see in our canon MCU, just in terms of some of the things he's doing during this. Of course, James Spader's Ultron was big, bad, and powerful, but he didn't really linger, like a Thanos or like a Loki. He had this one and done, which I always found a little bit strange given, the potential that I find that Ultron has as a character. So Ultron comes into the picture, and he is essentially taking over everything. He's nuking the world. He's created a drone army that's absolutely wreaking havoc. And before we get into that havoc, I just have to stop and talk for a second about Ultron in this episode. So something that really, really sort of deterred me during this episode, and I fought tooth and nail for that to not be the case, was the voice of Ultron. So I did not go ahead and look up who the gentleman is who voices the Ultron in this animated episode, but for those of you who are familiar with James Spader, he's a great talent, right? And he was such a talent as the voice of Ultron in the MCU. This version of Ultron, the voice that they've cast, to do this, really, really put me off over the course of the episode, and I had to fight tooth and nail to not let it sour the experience for me. And, you can tell that in terms of speaking on the dialogue and speaking on the acting, I think that, it's not that the lines are executed poorly, it's just that the voice to me was kind of one of those situations like Bucky Barnes in episode 1, right? The dialogue just feels almost kind of cliche, kind of cringy, and it just so happens that Ultron is sort of like the main central figure of this episode, right? Like, of course you have Natasha and you have Clint, but they are, ultimately just trying to put an end to Ultron, who is the centerpiece of this episode. So having his voice be really not quite fitting for me definitely caused some deterrence in what is otherwise, in my opinion, a really awesome episode. So the plot sort of follows these two going through whatever they can think of to sort of put this to an end. And, they actually come upon an idea of actually utilizing Arnim Zola, for those of you who remember the guy with the super Russian hardcore, Nazi shorter guy with the glasses in the Cap saga. they have this bright idea to maybe take his consciousness and trap it inside of Ultron, or sort of put his consciousness into a drone, which will then broadcast, into the Ultron and maybe stop him this way. Really just pulling out all the stops, right? And throughout the course of this episode, you see them kind of in this what looks like post-apocalyptic setting, fighting through armies of these drones, and there's some really good action sequences. I'm not going to lie. One of which in particular. Again, major spoilers, we got to throw them all out here. There is a scene in which Clint actually sacrifices himself for Natasha to be able to escape with Zola and attempt to, sort of commandeer Ultron and save the day. That was a very, very well done scene. It's very cool because, of course, this canon MCU has Black Widow essentially sacrifice herself, and Clint ultimately survives. So it was interesting to see that sort of reversal play out here. But beyond this, we come to find out that this strategy does not pay off. And the reason it does not pay off is a segue into what I think is the best part of this entire episode, which is a conflict that now arises between the Watcher, yes, the Watcher who cannot, will not, and should not intervene, as well as with Ultron. So what begins to happen here is Ultron becomes so hyper-aware and so, just in tune, I guess, with the world around him, and so intelligent, that he actually discovers that the Watcher exists. Now, that's a tall order, right? For someone to just be able to have that power, on a whim, even to hear Ultron be able to have that power sounds pretty intense. I think what plays largely into this is actually the fact that during this episode, Ultron comes to possess all 6 of the Infinity Stones. And how he does it is a little bit controversial. So there's a very, very short, very, very sweet kind of tidbit in this episode where Thanos actually appears sort of through a portal, like the way he kind of enters in very ominously and badass, right? And he appears and he's got the gauntlet on with all of these stones minus 1. And he immediately essentially lays eyes on Ultron, who actually bisects him or cuts him in half. Almost immediately. Like there's no fight, there's no, conflict. It is just boom, Thanos is cut in half. And a lot of people have seemingly taken to the internet to say that this was not, super, whether it was not super enjoyable or not super realistic. I thought it was kind of cool. I think it was a way to showcase that this Ultron is literally just that person, right? His power has surmounted well beyond anything you've seen. And, you think of what has been the most intense, most sort of, intimidating and all-powerful villain that we've seen. And for the most part, you'd probably say Thanos. So to see Ultron just sort of come in and immediately tear that to shreds is pretty intimidating. And I think that was a very deliberate and very altogether good, section to have in here. But fast forward again, he's got all the stones. He comes to this sort of understanding that the Watcher or someone is watching him and aware of what's going on. And he essentially breaks out of the universe that he's in and basically challenges the Watcher. And the Watcher now is sort of under this notion of like, oh my God, like throughout the entire series, you've known him as the person who, of course, won't intervene, but is aware of everything going on. He's conscious. He is able to see that the things that are happening around him in all these worlds are, not without consequence. In fact, there are many times that he even mentions, he wishes he could intervene and that, he wants to do something, but, it's in his sort of contract that he cannot, right? He mentions even in this episode that he swore an oath. He cannot, should not, will not intervene. But in this case, he has no choice. He is confronted by this Ultron. They have what is easily the best fight sequence of this entire series unfold. And, the Watcher, while who puts in pretty good work, ultimately feels like he kind of gets beaten. And in doing so, this opens up this doorway for Ultron to basically have free terrain access to all these multiverses, right? And he's essentially kind of now gotten this power that only the Watcher has had as far as time has told us, right? So the Watcher then is pretty much put between a rock and a hard place. What does he do? And what he does that kind of, brings this episode to a close is he actually confronts Supreme Strange. And for those of you who have been following, Supreme Strange is essentially the Doctor Strange that we saw unveiled in episode 4, who kind of is just this all-powerful, dark, ominous, and more, sinister version of Doctor Strange, for which we had to see an entire universe shut down. And the Watcher is now so desperate in this situation and things are so dire that he actually says, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I need your help. And that's kind of where the episode ends. So This, there's a lot to break down here, and I'm going to try not to make it, too hard to pick apart. But a couple of things I really think are noteworthy about this episode. We're now sort of being, it's solidified, I would say, that there are connections between these episodes, right? We're seeing that there's this Ultron who appears at the end of episode 7, seemingly from a visual perspective looks identical to the Ultron that we see at the beginning of this episode 8. We then see the Watcher sort of come to, he physically connects with Doctor, Strange, or Supreme Strange. That is a character that we've only been introduced to in this series. It seems like they're actually sort of mending these worlds together in a way that, we theorize that they would, but it's really, really cool actually to see them maybe meld a story that will continue to be told. I personally vented frustration that it sometimes seems hard when they throw out these episodes that you're like, oh, that's really, really cool, and it looks like it's setting up a sequel. And you have no idea when that sequel is going to be, right? Or if there's going to be a sequel. So for me, it was actually refreshing to see that there is a story that's carrying a little bit, beyond its base episode, because it prompts investment. It makes me want to return. It makes me even hopeful that the finale, maybe continues this Ultron narrative, right? Do we see Supreme Strange fight Ultron? Do we see the multiverses collide in some, mega insane battle, which, to be completely honest with you, I think should happen, and I'll go into that in a second. But it really sets the stage for the fact that anything is possible. And, that's kind of been the theme of this whole series, right? It is what if. There should be no bars. There should be no boundaries. And I think and hope that they're going to blow the lid off with the finale and just let things absolutely go chaotic. I mean, why not, right? There are no other avenues in the MCU canon where they have the freedom that they have here and now. And I don't think that there's any reason that they shouldn't go as over the top as possible with this finale. Whether that is bringing in characters like Captain Carter or maybe T'Challa as Star-Lord, just go crazy. Absolutely unload. It's your finale. We know there's a season 2. Go out with a bang, and I really, really hope they do. So let's wrap this one up, guys, with just sort of a high-level closure of it. What did I think about it? What do I rate it? So I can't say that it's a top 3 for me. It's probably top 5, which at this point, I'd say it's not asking a lot, but it is. These are 8 really solid pieces of content. I think the voice of Ultron really put a damper on it for me, unfortunately. The fight scenes definitely were a salvaging piece. Getting the engagement from the Watcher, who is just such a cool character to watch, and pun intended, I suppose. But it's just really, really cool to see him have even more engagement with us than he has in the past. Love that. And do genuinely enjoy the concept that we are being introduced to a continuation of a story that may actually see some sort of closure in the next episode. Or maybe it doesn't. But it's really, really cool to have that possibility that we can continue an animated story and I actually be kind of invested in it. So with that said, guys, I'm going to give this episode a B- for some very strong spots, but some somewhat weaker spots as well. And then we're going to go ahead and kick us into the finale, which will be coming up on us real soon, guys. Thank y'all so much for watching. Again, just to recap, for those of you watching on the YouTube channel, that is Tonight We Marvel, we have more content, we have more shows, and there will be more things to unpack rather soon, guys. So thank you so much for hanging out, and as always, peep out.